This is 5 Minutes to Better Fiction with Ashley Lester. In this session, I'm going to be talking about the importance of opening lines. Never underestimate the importance of a strong opening line. You never get a second chance to make a first impression. A good opening sets the tone of the forthcoming story. It can introduce character, intrigue, excitement, and more. It can set the pace of your story. It can also be the deal breaker as to whether or not your reader reads on. This means it could be the reason why your book is or isn't bought. And don't forget, an opening line doesn't just introduce the reader to your story and the characters, it introduces the reader to you and your voice. Never underestimate the importance of a strong opening line. Four ways of looking at opening lines here. I'm sure there are other methods, however, these work for me and they help me to illustrate the point I want to make. They are distinctive character voice, surprise and intrigue, foreshadowing, and thought-provoking openings. I'll go through each type with some examples. So, the first type of opening line I wanted to look at was the distinctive character voice. The sweat was lashing off a sick boy, he was trembling. This is Trainspotting by Irvine Welsh. Irvine Welsh gives us narration in a Glaswegian dialect, which makes the story a little different to most of the texts we've previously read. To discuss this in terms of style and substance, the substance of a good opening line is there because we're intrigued and want to know why Sick Boy is sweating and trembling and why he's called Sick Boy. The style could likely be a deal breaker for some readers because the challenge of reading such an unconventional text might be more than a reader wants to accept. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. As before, we've got a distinctive accent telling the story marked by grammatical deviance from the expected norm. This gives us an understanding of the character Huckleberry Finn and his social status. It also allows us to make an early decision as to whether or not we want to continue reading the story. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap, but I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. Catcher in the Rye gives us narration from the story's central character, Holden Caulfield, a cynical, sensitive rebel. Without Holden Caulfield's voice, Catcher in the Rye would have lost a substantial amount of its impact. Note how much character Salinger has pushed into this opening sentence. Never tell nobody but God. Alice Walker's opening line, To the Colour Purple, gives us the voice of Celie, a young black woman in the early 20th century American South. We have a sense of her religiosity and lack of grammar, which makes her voice all the more authentic. The caution I'd issue with any of these types of opening line is to be sure that the voice is telling your story in the way you want. When it works well, as with these examples, it's the perfect start. When it works badly, it can come across as condescending and inaccessible. A lot of guides will tell you that surprise and intrigue are the main features that are needed to hook the reader and make them read on. Raise a question that the reader wants answering, set a scene that needs to be witnessed to its conclusion, or do something surprising so the reader stays with the story until they've had their curiosity satisfied. were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold. Here we have Hunter S. Thompson, and he's going to tell his readers about the experience of doing drugs. I have friends who rank this as the best opening to any novel. I climbed Mount Everest 80,000 years ago. Here, I think, surprise and intrigue are found in abundance. I want to read on to find out how it's possible for someone to make this statement about climbing Everest 80,000 years ago. It was a bright cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. In this opening line, George Orwell cleverly has the clocks chiming the hour here, and this makes the reader wonder why the unusual number of 13 is now being struck. It's an efficient way of setting the story in the future when clocks might do something so anomalous. The anodyne description of a bright cold day in April sets the scene as being unremarkable, but that number 13 is always going to make most readers believe it's a portent of bad things to come. It was the day my grandmother exploded. Was she very angry and going on a shouting spree? Or was she the victim of an incendiary incident that resulted in a tragic outcome? Ian Banks has written this so that we have to read on to answer that question. However, not all openings go for surprise and intrigue. There are some that attempt to win over the reader by demonstrating a cleverness with words and ability to produce profound and thought-provoking phrases. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. This is Anna Karenina, and Tolstoy sets the tone and says something that gives us pause for reflection. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Jane Austen's opening to Pride and Prejudice is wordy, but it also offers us a very cynical truth that bears consideration. Is every rich single man in want of a wife, or is this just the belief of a society that advocates for its citizens to participate in the rituals of the predominant heteronormative hegemony? Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. I don't know if this is true, but I do know it's an observation that Hurston has placed in my mind, and I'm wanting to see if the rest of this text is just as thought-provoking. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. This opening line continues with Dickens showing us repeated binary oppositions before explaining that the historical period he is describing is as richly complicated as the reader's current time period. Some writers begin by giving their reader a clue about what's to come. This is the saddest story I have ever heard. In the UK, starting in the mid-90s, there was a product called Ronseal, which was advertised as doing exactly what it says on the tin. With The Good Soldier, we begin by bracing ourselves for new depths of sadness. It was love at first sight. Whilst Catch-22 isn't a love story, this beginning sets the tone for a story that follows the emotional ups and downs and highs and lows of a traditional romance. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. He's facing a firing squad. The intimation is that he's done something to merit state execution, and it also sounds like we're about to be treated to a flashback of the main character recalling a childhood memory. But we're now staying with the text to try and find out what happens to the colonel when the firing squad are given their instruction to fire. All this happened, more or less. We'll be talking about unreliable narrators in a future video, but Vonnegut's line here gives us a perfect example of someone who's telling us a story that we'll need to read on different levels. Some parts will be honest, some parts will be BS, and we're going to have a wonderful time sorting the truth from the BS. There are other ways of classifying opening lines, but personally I like this structure. However, notice how there's overlap between all of these groups. Some of the thought-provoking openers offer foreshadowing and distinctive character voices. Some of the distinctive characters also offer surprise and intrigue. Which leads us to the question: what are the rules for writing a good opening line? Ernest Hemingway said, to start, write the truest sentence you know. Whilst I don't think he was specifically talking about opening lines when he said this, I do think it's a good place to start. But keep in mind that it doesn't have to be the first thing that you write. I admit I have a friend who won't start a novel until she's settled on the perfect opening line, and this approach has worked well for her over the years. But I know of many other writers who get the words down on the page, shape the story, and then worry about touches of finesse like a well-crafted opening line. Although I've mentioned these factors as though they're essential, the truth is that the opening that works for you is typically the opening that works for you. It doesn't have to contain foreshadowing, character, intrigue, or thought-provoking observations. It needs to reflect the mood and the message of the story that's going to follow. We don't want Ford Madox Ford telling us that this is the saddest story he's ever heard, and then find he's cracking a list of off-colour gags. The opening line needs to set the correct tone. These are some of the pieces of advice I've read over the years. Never open with a description of the weather. Never open with dialogue. Avoid starting in media res. Don't use long words that will confuse your reader. Each one of these pieces of advice is not so much a rule as the personal preferences of some readers. The truth is, if breaking one of those rules is how you feel it's best for your story to start, that's how you should start the story. We're writers. We don't live by rules. Rules and programming are for AI. As a final way to get the most from these ideas, try applying them to stories you've enjoyed reading. How do your favourite authors get into a story? Do they use one of the approaches I mentioned earlier, or do they have their own unique style? Can you learn from them? Equally important, how do the authors you don't like begin their stories? Is there an immediate turn-off for you? If there is, What is it, and how can you avoid that same mistake? Read critically, analyse what's out there, and craft your fiction so it has the heart that's missing from AI. And finally, this is my website address, www.ashleylister.co.uk. Please stop by and say hi, subscribe to my newsletter, buy a book, and make sure you check out the next video I upload in this series. Thank you.